is a marketer, historian, Christian, and author of The Only Witness, a history on the Shroud of Turin, a historical fiction novel on the history of the Shroud. The Shroud is central to Powell's research, which spans 20 years. His focus, especially over the past 5 years, has been on the history of the Shroud following the death and resurrection of Jesus. Powell enjoys speaking on the Shroud's connection to the Gospels and its significance in Christian history, exploring both scientific and faith-based perspectives.
Okay. Yeah, no, I don't have it. Is it up here? Okay. Thanks, Joe. This is fantastic. Oh, very good. Mic is working okay? Fantastic. All right. So, thanks, Joe, and great to be here. Actually, it's kind of funny. Jack has spoken quite a bit on the image of Edessa and the Mandylion now, and so now that he's kind of warmed you up, I'm going to add to that. And his, some of his historical references are just awesome. His book is great if you want to really get a great book on history. His historical references there are just fantastic. Let's try that again. The funny thing about anything related to the Shroud or any of this stuff is that there's absolutely no controversy. And, so one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is the image of Edessa, and of course there's controversy with that. And one of the big hypotheses... yeah, please. That would be great. Go to the next one then, please. And, one of the big hypotheses or one of the big questions is whether the image of Edessa and the Shroud are one and the same. Now, what Jack had been talking about was the legend of the image of Edessa, or just the legend of Edessa. And because there's a handful of different things and pieces to that legend that are pretty important. And we're going to talk then through kind of the progression of that and add a little bit to what Jack has already done. So if you'd go to the next one. So I put together a map, and there's a couple of different paths that the Shroud may have taken, and or the image of Edessa may have taken. So the image of Edessa, as we listened to Jack, was that it was potentially created in Jerusalem. Obviously, it's the image of Jesus. It must have started in Jerusalem, just like the Shroud may have. And then, I really need my clicker if you can get it going. But click it, please, once. So there's two different paths. One path might be, which is kind of what Jack was talking about, which is to go from Jerusalem through Antioch, maybe a couple of other smaller places, and then up to Constantinople. And then if you'd click again. The other option is, and this one has been pretty popular, and as a matter of fact, that's what I have in my book, is the image of Edessa as a fiction book went from Jerusalem. Maybe it went to Antioch with Peter. Peter probably did early on. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it then went directly to Edessa, and then it stayed there for a handful of hundreds of years, and then it went to Constantinople. Now the next thing is it goes to, if you'd click again, we have a couple of other theories that we go from Constantinople possibly through Athens. I think with Othon de la Roche may have gone through Athens. And then up to Lyrae, or maybe not. Maybe there's a couple of different paths in there. But at some point in the 14th century, it ends up in Lyrae. If you'd click again. Another option is that after the Fourth Crusade, when the Latin Empire was basically bankrupt, and you have Baldwin II, he needs money. And so he sells... More or less, he sells a lot of the relics that he has to Louis IX in Paris. And so then these relics may have gone up to Paris and ended up in the Sainte-Chapelle and in the Grand Chasse, and then may have gone further. And we'll talk about where those went. Now, the question, though, is in one case is The shroud took one path, and the image of Edessa took another path. So if you'd click again, please. And then lastly, of course, we have pretty good documentation that from Lyrae, once it got to Lyrae, it went through, to Chambéry and then to Turin. And I mean, there's clearly, some travel in between. There may have gone to, some other cities. But in essence, it went from Lyrae, Chambéry, and then Turin. So our question then is, if these are one and the same, if the shroud and the image of Edessa are one and the same, how did they get to where they were? And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about. So next slide, please. All right, so, and next button, please. Okay, so let's talk about the actual, the legend, all right? Now the legend, as Jack said, it kind of evolved over time, and I'm going to kind of summarize it in a handful of different things, in a handful of different statements, and I'm not going to be as exact, because the legend, like he said, did change over time. It evolved depending upon who was writing things and what have you. So first of all, one of the big pieces of the legend is that it's Apgar V. Jack talked about Apgar V versus the 8th. Apgar V was alive when Jesus was alive. He was supposedly sick. He was supposedly had some kind of a disease. Sometimes some of the writers think he had leprosy, maybe he had gout, maybe he had all of the above. Not certain. The other thing is there's Apgar VIII, which we'll talk about, but right now I'm going to stick with Apgar V. Apgar V, the contemporary of Jesus. He writes a letter based on the legend. He writes a letter to Jesus, and he sends the letter with one of his assistants, the archivist known as Hanan, or whatever kind of, I've kind of simplified it and unified it into Hanan. It could be other ones. But he was known as the archivist for Edessa at that time. Okay. Now, this may have been immediately prior to the Passion, or it could have been a couple of weeks prior to it, or it could have been maybe even earlier. A little bit of uncertainty as to when it was in terms of the dating of it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then if you'd click again. Okay, so Jesus now, according to the legend, he responds in writing. And so now the legend says that Jesus actually wrote the response in his own hand, but there's other options where it may have been that he transcribed it, and basically a lot of the accounts of Jesus are that he never actually wrote anything. He always had somebody write it for him, and so whether he actually wrote it or not, or whether it was written for him, is certainly up in the air. But then there was, according to the legend, there is a written document that goes back to Apgar to basically say that, I'm sorry, my work here in Jerusalem is not yet done, and I need to complete that work, but I will send one of my emissaries after I'm gone. Okay, and if you'd click again. And by the way, that letter is quite often referred to as the Holy Letter. Now, there's a couple of different parts on this piece here. Is in the legend, the original legend and the original writing about the legend does not have an image in it. As Jack said, the first mention of the legend of the image is actually around the 600s. So Hanan, who supposedly is also a painter, he then is trying to paint the image of Jesus. Some of the versions of the legend have him actually painting Jesus. Some of them say he can't do it. His face is just too impossible to paint, and he can't paint it. So Jesus says, basically, give me a cloth, and and more or less a sweat cloth, and he puts it on his face, and somehow the image gets imprinted onto that cloth. And that is what's then known now as the image of Edessa, or later on the Mandylion. If you'd go next. So, and by the way, that was then miraculously created. So as Jack said, the akio aeropoieton, so miraculously created. So then Apgar now receives the image back, receives the letter back at a minimum. Maybe he sees the image. Depending upon whether what version of the legend you want, and then he, depending upon which version of the legend, he puts it in in maybe a table or a tablet, and he coats it with gold, and he adds jewels encrusted. And so there's a couple of different versions in there. One of the versions is that the image was created by the blood and sweat from Gethsemane. So as Jesus is, according to Luke, as Jesus is sweating, he's sweating blood, and then he puts this cloth on his face, and it then gets transferred miraculously onto the cloth. That's one of the versions. Okay, if you'd go next, please. Okay. So Jesus, in his letter, in the legend, it says that I will send someone after I'm gone. And it's basically, he then sends, he commissioned, afterwards it's Thomas that is responsible for the area of Syria and Mesopotamia. And Thomas then sends Thaddeus. And Thaddeus is, at that time, he was known as one of the 72. And so he is certainly, able to, to take given the responsibility to carry this letter, and also potentially, if there was an image, to be able to carry the letter. He meets Apgar, and he cures Apgar of his diseases. He cures other ones based on the legend, and he actually cures the whole city. And he then converts the whole city to Christianity. And this is Apgar V, roughly in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, depending upon the timing that you would think that he would have done that after Jesus' death. Okay, so next, please. Now, one of the problems now, and this is maybe less of the legend, but more of the history, is that Apgar's son, Manu, he stays and remains a pagan. And if he's a pagan, then part of the legend is that the image then gets hidden so that the pagans don't get access to it. So this is the whole story. So Apgar writes a letter. Jesus responds. He responds with the letter. There's an image. There may or may not have been an image. And then the image then is brought back. Apgar is cured by Thaddeus. And then there's paganism right after that, and potentially the image then gets hidden as well as the letter gets hidden. Okay, so that's kind of and I apologize, there's many different versions, as Jack kind of said, there's many different versions of the legend, and so each of these different pieces just depends upon the timing that we're looking at. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please, and one more. Okay, so. Now, step forward, this is a little bit more of the kind of the legend, potentially, depending upon what how you interpret the history of this, or the history of the legend, is that in one of the big dates is in 544, the Persians besiege the city of Edessa. Now, Edessa is right in the middle of the Persian Empire over here, and the Roman Empire over here, and unfortunately Edessa goes back and forth between being subjugated by the Persians and then subjugated by the Romans, and then back and forth. And in 544, the siege of Edessa takes place. The Persians are out there and they're building their siege works, and this Bishop Eulalios, he has a dream, and in his dream he finds out where the image is hidden. The image has been hidden for 500 years. It's been forgotten for 500 years. 544 comes along and says, where is, and he has this dream. It says, oh, it's in the main gate of Edessa. So the bishop goes and finds it. He marches around the city. One version of it, he marches around the city, and the Persians are then run off. There's other versions of that part of it. He goes down underneath the siege works, and he's able to get them to run off in any case. Okay, thank you. If we can go one more. Sorry, go back a second. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting, for those of us that might think that the image was caused by the blood and the sweat at Gethsemane, then the issue there is, was Hanan potentially there? Because he, based on the legend, he was there as the image was created by Jesus. There's nothing in the Bible that says that Hanan was part of in the upper room or in the image of Gethsemane or in the Last Supper. There's nothing that says that. So for me, that kind of says that the image was not caused by the blood and the sweat. I think that's a pretty powerful reason right there that it was not caused by that. It must have been caused by something earlier than that. Okay, if we could go forward once more. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm now going to go through the historical writings that are available to us. Some of them are maybe a little bit more, I don't know if accurate isn't the right word, but maybe more trustworthy than others. One of the things that as I've been going through the history here, especially for this, is that when you look at the historical documents, there's so many reasons why you can't really read them or trust them to be 100%. I write a document. My English is terrible. Nobody can understand it, and we read it 2,000 years later, and I go, I don't know what he said there. How do I interpret this word there, right? That's one thing. Then, of course, there's my truth, there's your truth, and there is the truth. I have my opinion, you have your opinion, and then there's there's what really happened. There's my biases, and then we have stuff that's written in Greek or in Latin or whatever, and that gets translated. So it gets translated to French or to Italian or to English or German or whatever it is, and the translator, the modern day translator, has biases. And so, when you think about it, so as we're reading each one of these documents, especially as we get older and older and older, and go back further in time, the translations or what we're reading today may not be as accurate as we'd like it to be. It's not like what Kelly Kearse had, where he did the A test and the B test, and he said, man, the blood is there and it's not there. The serum is there and it's not there. Well, in history, you kind of have to look at it and say, well, let's take this translation or let's take that translation. I've used, for most of the work here, I've looked at Marinelli and some of her references, and then Nicolati, and then also Guskin, and then Dubarl, and I've translated them. I use Google Translate to translate quite a bit of them. And one of the things that I found is the translations also evolve. So if you look at Nicolati's translation versus Guskin's translation of some of these things, they evolve, and they're different. One word might mean something here, and one word might mean something there, depending upon who's translating. So then, here we are. We have now a handful of different references specifically to the image of Edessa. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is some of those contradict some of the other ones, or maybe they're all true. And so what our goal is as kind of historians, is to look at each one of them and kind of figure out, well, let's see what really may have happened. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so one other point that I wanted to bring up is about 944 AD, the name of the image of Edessa kind of started to change, and it was called the Mandylion. And that Mandylion derives from, depending upon which language, mandil, mantilla, mantella in Latin, and then small cloth or Latin, implying that it is a relatively small cloth, not a large cloth. Now, of course, we have the shroud, 14 feet by 3 feet, and we may have this Mandylion, which is maybe just a small napkin. So there's kind of a hint right there that maybe the Mandylion is just a small cloth that's not the full 14-foot shroud. All right, that's one test. If you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now let's look at some of the various accounts that are hopefully historical. Now, the biblical accounts talk about the resurrection and the linens and the shroud being in the tomb, and there's myrrh, and there's other perfumes, and with 75 pounds of aloes and what have you. So there's potentially now first of all, a reference to a cloth that's of an image now, as we understand it, the shroud of a dead Jesus. That face on here is of a dead Jesus. The image of Edessa, based on the legend, was created prior to his death. So that image is of a living face. And the eyes are going to be open, they're not going to be closed. And there's going to be other things. You're not going to have all the bruising on the face, and you might not have the notch taken out of the chin, and you're certainly not going to have any of the blood marks on there. So the The image of Edessa that we might know and might be able to see and see references to is going to be of a living Christ. And that's basically, the result of how we could interpret the biblical accounts. If we can go to the next one. Okay, then the next one, please. Then we have Paul in Galatians. So Paul writes a letter to the Galatians, and he says, and Jack said this, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified, dead, not living, dead." This is around 48 to 54 AD. 48 to 54 AD. The legend says that the Mandylion was created when Jesus was alive. And yet here we have something in 48 to 54 of a dead Christ, and it's in Galatia. Galatia is kind of like the middle of modern-day Turkey. Edessa is way off to the east, maybe, I don't know, 2 weeks by foot or by horse, I guess. And and it never says that Paul brought the shroud or an image all the way out to Edessa. Now it's possible. I'm not saying that it's not. My interpretation of how I would read that is that Paul was talking about the shroud, and all the way over in Edessa now is maybe some other image. All right, if you'd go to the next one, please. And the next one. Okay. Jack mentioned Bardesanus. Bar Desan actually means of the river of Desan, and Desan is the river that flows through Edessa, or modern-day Sanliurfa in Turkey. And here's then what he wrote in the Hymn of the Pearl. Now, it's possible that he didn't write this. It could be his son. The details, as I mentioned earlier on, we don't even necessarily know who wrote this, but it's pretty certain that it was either Bardesanus or his son. And his parents were part of the court of Apgar VIII. So this is then in the 190s to the 210s. And so a little bit later, not in the 30s, 30 or 40s like the original references, but in the 180, 190 to 210. "At once, as soon as I saw it, the glory looked like my own self. I saw it in all of me, and saw me all in all of it. The King of Kings, and then the garment seemed to me to become like a mirror of myself." Well, that, is a mirror, a life-size image. So now Jack is basically saying that the shroud was then taken to go to the conversion of Apgar VIII, and then it was brought back again. So it may have come from Antioch, then out to Edessa, and then maybe back again. So that's kind of maybe an interpretation here. It could be that this just conflates with the image, and maybe they say, well, here's the image. It was in Edessa. It didn't go back. This doesn't say that it went back. There's no travel reference here. However, he did talk about, Jack did talk about the Abersia, so if you go to the next one, please. Keep going, one more. And so Bishop Abersius, he was buried in Phrygia, which is also central Turkey, roughly. And he writes, having crossed the Euphrates. So he clearly went past the Euphrates, which is to the east end of Turkey, and past that is then, which would be where Edessa is. And set before me food from the fish. We talked about that. So the fish being Jesus, the spotless virgin, the mother, and gave to this friends to eat, always having sweet wine. So wine is blood, and giving the mixed cup with bread. So kind of like the Eucharist. Now that one again is possible. For me, this one is pretty. I don't know, obtuse is maybe the word that I'd use. It's not really a direct reference. None of these things say, that, hey, I had the shroud and I took it with me and I showed it to people and I came back. And, and one of the reasons for that is the discipline of the secret. You didn't want the Romans or the Jews or anybody else to find out that this incredibly valuable cloth existed. Okay, so if we go to the next one. And so that's the question, is did Abersius bring it, or was it already there? Or something like that. All right, so let's go to the next one. All right, so those four references are kind of early, about between the first century, maybe all the way up to 300s or so. And I'm going to talk a little bit more as we go forward. And if you'll notice, I had on the right, I had like some checks over here in red and some checks in green. Well, those are the ones that kind of point this way maybe, and those are the ones that kind of point that way. So right now it's kind of up in the air. You've got some people that, hey, there was an image potentially in Edessa. Now comes to one of the most confusing ones. And there's two different translations for this one, the Nicolati translation and the Guskin translation. And he writes, this is Gregory Referendarius. So Referendarius, he has a sermon when the image of Edessa was brought to Constantinople. He writes a sermon the next day and gives his sermon on August 16th in 944. And he talks about basically what seems like the cloth. Now, depending on whose translation you want to use, but Jesus undergoing the passion of his own free will, believing that human nature fears death. Indeed, death comes upon the very nature that was made to live. Taking his linen cloth, he wiped the sweat that was falling down his face like drops of blood in his agony. In his agony, to me, is a reference to the passion. And that's kind of what Guskin says, and that's what Nicolati talks about. That's to his passion. That's the shroud. He's talking about the shroud there. Drops of blood. And miraculously, just as he made everything from nothing, in his divine strength, he imprinted the reflection of his form on the linen. Now, there's a lot of, how do you translate this form? Is it the form of his face or the form of his body? So there's a couple of different things in here we have to be careful about. And depending on who you want to believe, the form could be the body or it could be the face. The reflection, however, let everyone be inspired with the explanation, has been imprinted only by the sweat of the face of the originator of life. So here he's now talking about the face. Here we had the form and the body, now we've got only the face. So why is he being so confusing for us? Why is he confusing, on the one hand, the shroud potentially with drops of blood, and then the image of Edessa with just the sweat from his face? So he's kind of thinking that the sweat from his face created this image more or less from the Garden of Gethsemane. Is kind of how I would interpret that. For these are the beauties that have made up the true imprint of Christ, since after the drops fell, it was embellished by drops from his own side. That's the shroud, the blood from his own side, right? Both. This I think is really interesting here. Both are highly instructive. Why is he talking about two things? So it's possible that you can interpret this as he's talking about the Mandylion over here and the shroud over there. Both are highly instructive. Blood and water there. Here, sweat and image. So sweat and image would be the Garden of Gethsemane, is his interpretation of how the image was made. And on the other side, he's going blood and water there. So Guskin's interpretation of this is blood and water there. He's pointing more or less to the shroud on the one side, and he's pointing to the other one, which is the Mandylion over here. That's one interpretation. Okay? And but since both have their origin in the same person, so he's clearly talking about two things again. Okay, so if we could move on. And one more. Now, there's one other that's kind of interesting, and I kind of ran into this one as part of this research, but it's Nicholas Meserides. Now, he's, and I don't know how you pronounce this, a Sciophylax. He is the priest in charge of the relics. Here I am in Constantinople. I am in charge of the relics. Well, I can see them at any time. I can touch, well, maybe not touch them, but I can certainly make sure that they're there and have access to those relics. And so if he has access to the relics, one of the things he says is the burial shrouds of Christ. These are made of linen, a material unsuitable for the suitable for the occasion, yet fragrant with myrrh. Fragrant with myrrh. Fragrant with myrrh means there was myrrh on the linen cloth. And just as an aside, I remember Barry being asked one time. He said, Barry, when you were in the chapel, in the Guarini chapel, and did you smell anything on the shroud? Was there a smell? And he said, oh, I don't remember. Now, Barry, of course, was a smoker. And so as a smoker, You may not smell everything, so it's possible that he just didn't smell it. It may have been there. But if you read a little further, fragrant with myrrh, exceedingly perishable, which means to me very, very, very faint. And because they restrained the uncircumcised dead, naked, anointed with myrrh after the passion. So here he is. There is a cloth, a burial cloth that has myrrh in it. Would I ever put a cloth, a hand cloth, would I ever put myrrh on a hand cloth that I'm going to wipe on my face? So my guess is probably not. So the shroud has the smell of myrrh in it, but the mandylion, if it exists, doesn't have that smell. So that's kind of another argument, and that's kind of why then the red X here again, that to me kind of says, wow, that's really, that's a pretty good differentiator. Okay, if we go to the next one, please. One more, please. Okay, then we have our good friend Robert de Clary. Here he is. He's battling. He's the chronographer of the chronicler of the conquest of Constantinople, and he writes about the various cloths in Constantinople. And he goes, and among the rest, there was another of the churches which they called My Lady St. Mary of Blachernay, where was kept the sidoin in which our Lord had been wrapped, which stood up straight every Friday so that the features of the Lord could be plainly seen there. So he's talking about a large cloth. He's not talking about a small face cloth. He's talking about a large cloth. And and he also has a mention of the mandylion, and I apologize, I don't think I added it to my list here. But nevertheless, he also differentiates between the shroud and the mandylion as he's retelling some of the story of the relics that are in all the churches. Okay, next please. And and he sees two separate cloths. Sorry, I didn't put the quote in here, but go ahead, one more. Okay. Now, I don't know, these I have trouble with. I can't quite date them, at least I haven't yet. Maybe Jack has. He's incredibly good at history. And the Synaxarium and the Meneon. The Synaxarium is it's basically a set of writings that talks about the saints, and it defines the saints and what day their feasts need to be. And now it started in about the 10th century in Constantinople, and they were just trying to track all the saints. And one of the Synaxarium, one of the writings in there is, in life you wiped your form onto a linen cloth. In death you were placed in the final linen shroud. In life, that's he's alive. This must, to me, refer to the mandylion. In death, you were placed in a final linen shroud, a final linen shroud. So it's not just a linen shroud. And so the there right there is really referring to two different cloths as well. Okay, thank you. One more. One more. All right. So I put together a handful of hypotheses, and let's just go through the main one, of course. I've got about 8 of them when I get done with the paper, and unfortunately today I've only got 45 minutes or so. So really we're going to just go through the one and just click again, please. And the one that I really want to talk about, and really I'm just presenting the facts as I've seen them. It's up to you guys to decide what your opinions are. I know that there's opinions all the way across the board, and I'm okay with that. And I just think it's kind of interesting, though, nevertheless, to see what some of the hypotheses that come out of the study of the image of Edessa and the Mandylion. So first of all, is the Mandylion one and the same with the shroud? Okay, that's the first hypothesis. The next, please. And if that's true, of course, then the Holy Shroud is equal to the Mandylion. The next, please. The image of Edessa is a sweat cloth with a miraculously generated image imprinted on it, an archaeoperaton, or however you pronounce it, and by a living Jesus. So that's my hypothesis. So here we're believing that it's of the living Jesus, and it's got an image on it. Whether it came from sweat or blood sweat, that's one of the other, some of the other hypotheses. I'm going to have you skip over, so just keep clicking a minute here. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. In interest of time, keep going, keep going. Okay. So actually, the reason why I got into this, and it was Julio, I've been putting together a series over time of images of the Christ Pantocrator, going all the way back to the 350s, and then all the way up to the 1355 or so, and when in Lyrae, and then of course you have the old images of Jesus, which you have the lamb, where he's carrying it, he looks like a Roman, and then after that he starts to look like the image of the shroud. And I've been writing that, and then Giulio says, well, you got to put the Mandylion in. And he threw me a big loop, and so now I've been spending about a year putting all this together. So one of the things is that, as I mentioned early on, is one of the legends is that one of the elements of one of the legends is that that Apgar V wanted to venerate the image, and he wrapped it in gold, and he encrusted it with jewels. And so I kind of played around, and so this is kind of what I have. So we have the left, of course, is the shroud, and on the right then is the shroud wrapped in gold, and then and then there'd be jewels on it. So if you'd go to the next slide, please. So what I did, as I've been collecting images for my original project, I had all these images that go all the way back, in this case, for the Mandylion, all the way back to 600s or so. It's called the Anka icon. And that one kind of looks like my imaginary one there on the left, which may have been kind of what the original one looked like. And you can see Jesus in the middle, and he's got the nimbus, and he's got his, the ICXC in his hands. And that one is in Turkey, in Klarjeti, and as I recall, that's it's kind of in the center kind of east Turkey, so it's not too far from Edessa. Then you have, moving forward, you go all the way to the Sancta Sanctorum. There's one dated roughly AD 754, the Holy Face of Genoa, 1240, and then San Silvestri, 1350, and the Holy Face of Jane in Spain, 1350, and then there's Alicante. And if you look at these images, they all kind of follow the same kind of a prototype. They've got the big round eyes, they've got a long nose, and they all have kind of the beard and the hair kind of mixed in, right? And it's interesting how they kind of, evolve over time, and yet they're also very similar. I mean, if you look at this one and that one there, I mean, those two really look very similar. Now, let's go to the next slide, please. This one is the Christ Pantocrator mosaic in the Cefalu Cathedral in Palermo. It's dated to roughly 1145 to 1150. And if you look at this image very clearly follows many of the markings on the shroud. And what I've done with the book that I was telling you about with Giulio is I've taken Paul Vignon, and he has 37 markings that he identifies with images of the shroud, and I've scored them more or less every image, and this one is actually the highest scoring image of all the Pantocrator images that I've found. And I found maybe 50 in my time period. And of course, you think about the iconoclasm when images were broken, and so a lot of the images in Constantinople and the surrounds were destroyed, unfortunately, at that time. And so, there you actually don't find that many that are from modern-day Istanbul, but you do find a whole bunch in Rome and outside of them where the iconoclasm wasn't so strong. So here we have, if you look at the shroud, one of the things that I find probably the most important marking is the notch in the beard. It's not in the center, it's off to the side. And that in the Gospels it says they ripped out part of his beard. And so, they didn't rip it out in the middle, they ripped it out from wherever, and it was on the side. So in the shroud, you'll see that that notch is off to the side. Of course, we have the E blood stain, except now it's been kind of humanified or livingified, and that's the blood marking coming out of the middle of the forehead. You have the part in the hair, and we have the part in the hair. You have the left side hair tress here larger on this side versus that side. And so I went through all of Vignon's markings, 37 of them, and I've scored these images, and as I said, this one is like one of the highest. And so when you think about that image, the prototype that the artist used for this was the shroud. Now, I have trouble with that because I don't know if they actually had access to the shroud, if the artisan actually had access at that time. But I'm going to ignore that for the moment and just say that this right here is one way for us to look at it. Now, there's a whole bunch of other conclusions that can come out of this, and that is 1145. This is way before the dating of the carbon dating. All right, so if that's now kind of the prototype of Christ Pantocrator based on the shroud, let's go take a look at some more images. Now, all of these images, most of them are coming from the East. So some of these are in Ukraine and Russia, modern-day Russia and what have you. And if you'll notice, the face on these is very different than the face on the other 6 that I showed earlier on. These all have this prototype, in my opinion, the shroud. You've got, in this one here, you've got the thing, the E coming down, you've got the long nose, you've got the beard coming down, you've got the separate thing here on the top of his lip, etc., etc. All of these are based on the shroud, and yet they are called Mandylion. If you look these images up, they're all labeled as Mandylion images. They're not labeled as Pantocrators, they're labeled as Mandylion. And so if you go through this, it's pretty certain that, at least from 1130, these images were based on what I believe as being the shroud. Very different than those other images, which started in the 600s, which to me are based on some other image, possibly the real Mandylion. Okay, so that's another set of facts. That's kind of how I would interpret the images. If you would go on to the next one, let's skip over that one. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so I put together a time frame, and different time frames, and I'm probably going to have to end here. So I go from from resurrection, and I'm now really referring to the Mandylion and Image of Edessa all the way up to 1793. And so, as we heard from Jack, what I call the tradition, you have the resurrection, and you have then potentially the letter, and then you have the image. And then from 33 roughly up to the 4th century, you have kind of what I call the creation of the tradition. There's a lot of different writings in there, and they're talking about whether about the history. And at that point, by the way, they're only ever talking about the letter. The image of Edessa doesn't get mentioned until late in the 6th century. Now you go further, you go to 544, that's the siege of Edessa, so there's some interesting things there with the marching supposedly. Personally, I think that the image of Edessa was created then as a ruse to get rid of to scare off the Persians. But I don't really have a good basis for that other than the timing. Because right after that, Procopius writes his history, and he talks about the siege of Edessa, and then I think it's Evagrius that then finally mentions the image, and I might be confusing things. But then you go up to the iconoclasm, the 1st and the 2nd, 8th and 9th century, and during the iconoclasm, politics get involved. There's one side that says, no, don't destroy the images. And then there's the emperor over here saying, no, we got to destroy these things. These are bad. They go against the 2nd commandment. And so there's a lot of politics going on. And of course, just like modern day politics, you got Trump and Harris and this guy and that guy. And their messages have nothing to do with real history. Now, they may have some history certainly behind them, but there's politics involved. And as soon as that's the case for me, I kind of discount any of those writings as they refer to, as they refer to the image of Edessa. 944, the image of Edessa is brought to Constantinople. We have the 4th Crusade with Robert de Clary. And then in 1355, we have the Lyrae ascensions, right? Lyrae, the shroud is being exhibited. Well, we also have right after the 4th Crusade, as I mentioned, we have Baldwin II selling the relics. One of them clearly identified as the Mandylion, or what he believes to have been the Mandylion. And that is identified and inventoried all the way from I think it's 1237, all the way up to the French Revolution. And it's in the inventory, they count it. Now sometimes they say it's a table, it's a tablet, it's a this, it's a that, but they're clearly talking about some kind of an image which they believe is the Mandylion. And if the Mandylion and the Shroud were one and the same, then how could we be having exhibitions in Leray when the Mandylion is clearly in the listed in the inventories that stretch from over those 500 or 600 years. And so with that, those are the facts that I've found. I'd love if you had different facts that I can add to this. Even Jack this morning, he brought up a couple of interesting references. I'd love to add them in some fashion. So with that, thank you very much. Massimo.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Since you mentioned, I want to ask Jack, we had to run out of the time. When you presented the issue of the letter to Galatians 3:1, both you and Jack mentioned the translation to be, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, in front of whose very eyes Christ crucified was portrayed." Unfortunately, I don't know what translation you used, I don't know what Jack were. In the Greek original translation, there is not very, in front of whose eyes. That seems to have been an addition that is being used by intentionally or unintentionally, but people who try to... is John Locke in the room by any chance? No. 2-3 years ago in the Shroud Science Group, there was an issue about the interpretation of this passage. I take 2 days to explain that I work as an interpreter, so in order to translate a passage, you need to place in a context. You cannot base on just on one verse.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
yeah, no, absolutely, I appreciate it. And let me talk to you more in detail afterwards, because I do want to understand that further. Yes, Bob.
You haven't mentioned Ian Wilson's hypothesis of tetradiplon, that the image of Edessa was folded in 4 and placed inside a frame of a trellis, I guess he called it, and that explains why they're one and the same thing. And under his hypothesis, so there must be a reason you didn't mention that, so I want to hear how you deal with that.
The reason was 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Because be honest with you, sorry, just a second. Yeah.
And then...
fair enough. But in any case, and I agree with that, or partially, but I didn't have time. I mean, if I wanted to go through all this, I had like 80 slides altogether.
Very good. There's also Paul Batty, who thought that the Veronica was the byssus cloth laid on top of the face of the shroud. So
yeah, and that one I've studied as well a little bit. There's a couple of issues with what has been drawn of that, because it hasn't been displayed for a couple hundred years, and when it was, they were only allowed to make artistic copies of it. And the interesting thing about the Veronica, if it was a cloth that was used to wipe Jesus' face when he was going down the Via Dolorosa, it shows his forehead being totally empty with no scars. And it doesn't show that the cloth was ripped. He's got thorns up here. How could you put the Veronica on his face without it getting ripped or torn or something like that? So, but that is talk. Yes. Who? Oh, go ahead, John.
So, Guy, let's see here. I'd just like to urge a lot of caution about the claim that Paul's Galatians 3:1 refers to the shroud. I've done a lot of research into it, and I find there are only about 4 or 5 researchers these days who have supported that. It's a relatively new idea. Everyone who has written about it in recent years has displayed, unfortunately, real unawareness of the geographical problems involved, the enormous distances, the months and months, even years of travel, or let's say, for any any early Christian to have taken the shroud to Galatia. Do you all know where Galatia is? I think most of you do. It's in central Anatolia, approximately 300 miles one way from Antioch. The Apostle Paul, he went there, and his journey was about 1,200 miles. Okay, so that's a long time. It's supposed to have taken him up to a year. And I would ask you to just consider the idea of some apostle, early Christian, carrying along, and I don't mean to blame you, Guy, I think your presentation was very good. I have a few other minor corrections or possible alternatives to give you.
Fantastic.
I don't have time for that now, but Galatians in particular, it disturbs me that so many people. Also the linguistics involved. There are really only 2 or 3 words in Galatians 3:1, if you read it carefully. Only 2 or 3 words which could conceivably refer to the shroud, and there are many other alternative interpretations, translations of those words. So anyone is interested, I wrote and I'll wrap it up here real quick. I wrote an article for the British Society for the Turin Shroud. It appeared in the summer 2024 issue 1 year ago. It's not yet out. It should be out in a few more months on shroud.com for anyone at all to read freely. And if you would like to read it here, I have a copy of it here, so please ask me if you're curious.
Thank you, John. Yeah, Mark.
Couldn't Paul have just heard of an image instead of seeing it himself? My statement was, couldn't Paul have just heard of an image in Edessa like that in his many travels instead of seeing it himself?
Paul had evangelized the Galatia. Then the Galatia had been reached by some newly Christian that had been dominated by some Christian that are Jewish origin. So it's like, who has bewitched you? So, because I very, very clearly described you in front of whose eyes was the eyes of the imagination. I described you, Christ crucified, so well that you should have understood my evangelization. That was the point.
I wouldn't rule either one out.
Pardon?
I wouldn't rule either.
Yeah. Let me get one last question. You go ahead.
Can you explain
You're going to have to ask him afterwards.
mosaics in Rosina and how they actually portray the face of Jesus, including the way that his side of his face was damaged from the...
Paul.
Sorry. Can you explain the mosaics in Ravenna, which show the face of Jesus being damaged, and that was, I think, 544, something like that?
Yeah, there's a handful there. I can talk to you offline about that, because that doesn't really get into this, but I actually have been investigating that. So, yeah, would love to get your opinion on that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me, all right, so I've been kicked out. Thank you very much.
If anybody else has any other questions, you can see Guy outside the hall.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guy.
Thank you very much.